really very pleased to have with us Norm Ornstein, who is the preeminent national observer of American politics in my mind. And the distinctive feature that Norm brings to our public debate here in Minnesota and around the country is that he has intelligence and data. And I know a lot of people who are smart, but they don't have the data, and so it's a kind of a fishing expedition. Then you got some people who have data, but then really lack the ability to present it in an intelligible way that the rest of us can find meaningful. And Norm brings those all together. We're obviously very proud of Norm. He is a Minnesotan, grew up here, his family's still here, got his bachelor's degree here at the University of Minnesota, which we are proud of. He went on to get his PhD at the University of Michigan, a little ways away. As I mentioned, he is a very prominent commentator. You may have seen him on CBS. He's on the NewsHour fairly regularly. He has a weekly column in Roll Call, which I read regularly and recommend it to you. He's co-director of the American Enterprise Institute and Brookings Institution Election Reform Project, which this obviously is very connected to. He's involved in a lot of other projects, whether it's campaign finance. The very good work on campaign finance has been done by Norm Ornstein and a small group of earnest, smart, and obviously persistent reformers in a number of other areas. It's a real pleasure to welcome Norm Ornstein.
Thanks so much, Larry. I'm delighted to be back. I was thinking as you were introducing me that intelligence and data, I guess that means I'm not eligible to run for public office these days. It is great to be here at a particularly fascinating time. Of course, all eyes are on the 2010 elections. I'm in particular watching one bellwether contest that I think really could have a lot to do with determining the future of the nation. And of course, I'm referring to the contest for mayor of Wasilla, Alaska, where Levi Johnston has emerged as a candidate. In Washington, we're still kind of dazed and stunned at the second breakup of Levi Johnston and Bristol Palin. I mean, if they can't make it, what couple can? Of course, that's not the only breakup that has kind of hit the political class this year. We were also stunned by the breakup of Al and Tipper Gore. People still puzzled at 40 years, how could that happen? I can now bring you the inside story. It turns out that Al came home unexpectedly one night and found another man's carbon footprints in their bedroom. It was... As for Bristol Palin, besides dancing on the stars, she is out on the lecture circuit. This remains a great country. $14,000 for giving speeches on abstinence. So after this election, no doubt Carl Palladino can make a comeback giving speeches on anger management. And Christine O'Donnell on comparative religions. We, of course, learned about her dabbling in witchcraft, and Sarah Palin came to the defense of Christine O'Donnell and blamed the lamestream media for trying to destroy her. And, of course, the media fought back. One anchor said, "That's just ridiculous. If we wanted to destroy her, we'd just douse her with buckets of water." We are, of course, at a time with a very difficult political environment for President Obama. His approval ratings have dropped again. Things are so bad that Muslims are accusing him of being a Christian. And he's losing support in unanticipated places. You perhaps saw on the Today Show last week that President Obama said he supports having a much longer school year. So this morning, Sasha and Malia announced that they've switched their support to Sarah Palin. And of course, there are two clear front runners for the Republican nomination. No, Governor Pawlenty, you're not one of them. There are two ex-governors, of course, Sarah Palin and Mitt Romney. One obsessed with hair, looks, and clothes, and the other is from Alaska. So, with that underbrush out of the way, let me move on to the much less funny part. I have been in Washington now for 41 years this month, and immersed in our politics and policy. And I have to say flatly that I have never seen it this dysfunctional. And we have had plenty of periods where we thought it just couldn't get any nastier or more brutish or more difficult than it was. Going back to when I first arrived with the tension over the Vietnam War, a deeply divisive issue that before very long segued into the impeachment process for Richard Nixon. For those of you too young to remember that and can only remember the impeachment of Bill Clinton, that was much, much more mild by comparison. We were in uncharted territory when we went through the impeachment process with Nixon, and there really were fears that we could end up with martial law or that the entire political system could just be shredded. In fact, in some ways, the fact that the two parties ended up coming together, a number of Republicans reaching a point where they saw that this presidency was no longer tenable, some of them having the guts to actually go to the White House and the Oval Office to tell the president that, and joining together with substantial bipartisan support on the House Judiciary Committee to come up with articles of impeachment. Perhaps ironically, that made the impeachment of Clinton a much easier lift and had people encouraged to move for it when it was a more frivolous gesture because it clearly was something that the society could withstand. So we weathered those storms and others that moved beyond. Now it's becoming much, much more difficult to weather them. We have a sharp ideological polarization that certainly started some years ago in Washington to become noticeable. The virtual collapse of the center and the dwindling of any of those who were either genuine moderates or, as we've seen even more within the past 4, 5, or 6 years, those who are pretty strong on the ideological front, but whose instinct is to solve problems and find ways to develop common ground, and the replacement by people taking a much harder line, the partisan rancor. I've often reflected at this podium about how when I came to Washington, we used to see members of either political party referring to those on the other side as their adversaries. Because, after all, it's the nature of our political system where you've got a separation of powers where the parties don't necessarily have all the reins of power at any given time, where people are elected individually in an extended republic and might have very different points of view. Your adversary one day can become your ally the next. But now it's the enemy, and it's a different phenomenon. And the willingness to destroy an enemy, grind him or her into the dust, hope they never return, is a phenomenon that we didn't see all that often in prior decades. Now, we could spend a lot of time tracing the roots of these changes, and I should add that we have a lot of literature, people like political scientist Mo Fiorina and his allies poo-pooing this and suggesting that this was and has been a Washington phenomenon, that it's not reflected in the country as a whole. And there is no doubt that the center didn't collapse in the same way around the country, but we see increasing signs in surveys and in other places that the tribalism is really starting to take hold in a bigger way, and for a variety of reasons, and that we're losing any sense of the public square, a place where at least people can share a common set of facts and then argue, however vigorously and aggressively we want, about where those facts should take us in terms of solutions. Now, I could go back, and just in a very brief way I will, to one important root of these changes, which is the dramatic regional transformation of our politics. And you could look, if you wanted one particular trigger, at the moment when Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act and turned to his then aide, Harry McPherson, and said, this is going to cost us, the South, the Democrats, the South, for a generation or more. And of course, he was right. The civil rights revolution caused dramatic changes in our politics. The Democratic Party, which had a 40-year stranglehold on a majority in the House of Representatives from 1954 to 1994, and for almost all of that time in the Senate, which controlled the White House for 20 consecutive years from 1932 on, was a party that had a wonderful alliance, wonderful for winning, between Southern conservatives, who made up at times half the party in Congress, and then dwindling to maybe 2/5, with the non-Southern, call them Northern liberals. But as the South began to change in the civil rights era and moved from being solidly, uniformly Democratic at almost all levels, to the point where it is now, which is really the Republican bastion. It is the single largest repository of Republican strength inside Congress. Now, that wasn't just the civil rights era moving along. It was also migration. Elderly, snowbirds moving south, and businesses sending executives into friendlier territory with lower taxes and less regulation, including the South and the Southwest. And it was a pattern that actually had been continuing for more than a century, a movement from the North and Northeast and less hospitable weather, something we don't know anything about here in Minnesota, to the West and the South. But it transformed not just the South, but those other regions as well. When I first came to Washington in the late 1960s, there were a very substantial number of moderate and liberal Republicans, a lot of them from New England and the Northeast. The Vietnam War era, the anti-war sentiment was as strong among liberal Republicans like Jacob Javits and Charlie Goodell of New York as it was with George McGovern and other anti-war Democrats. Some from the Midwest and the West Coast, which was a bastion of moderate Republicans, was a much redder region, including people like Mark Hatfield, say, of Oregon, back then Tom Kuchel of California as well. And those regions lost a lot of their Republican-leaning residents and picked up a lot of additional people, including, of course, in places like California, Mexicans and others moving up from the South, and became reliable bastions for the Democratic Party, to a point where just an election or two ago, we actually had this window, which is going to be closed with this election, where there wasn't a single Republican House member from the entire region of New England, a place that used to be a bastion of that support. So that had a lot to do with it. But there were other factors as well. The growth and dominance of the permanent campaign, where now the legislative process, it's just been striking to me being immersed in Congress, where I used to go into offices or go off on retreats with different groups of members, and there'd be a couple of staff people and one or two outsiders. And now the staff people have been supplanted by the pollsters and the political consultants, and the pollsters and the political consultants are the staff people. They used to go away after an election and do something else and then come back. Now they dominate the process. And as we moved to 1994 and we saw that 40-year stranglehold the Democrats had on power in the House disappear with Newt Gingrich's ability to move his party into a majority, we have now been in an era of extremely closely divided parties and power structures, so the stakes have gone up. Put together this combination of the loss of the center, the parties moving off to the extremes, and high stakes, because a change in party majority means something dramatic. It's no longer moving from the equivalent of one 40-yard line to the other. It's moving from behind one goalpost to behind the other. And any notion of working with somebody on the other side just dissipates because it really is sleeping with the enemy, and it might increase their chances of gaining a few seats at the margins. And as we're seeing with this election, as we look at whether Democrats are right at the cusp of that magic number in the House of losing 39 seats, and the difference between losing 35 and losing 45 is a difference between a Speaker Pelosi and a Speaker Boehner. It is very, very substantial. So all of those things joined together with the increasingly partisan nature of the media, where we are going really back to the future. We're much more resembling the 19th century, where you have partisan media, but media with such a much greater reach than we've ever had before, and where, getting back to the public square, we are seeing stark differences now in what groups of Americans believe to be true. And the idea in this day and age that 43% of Republicans believe that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, and 41% believe he's a Muslim. To believe that Obama was not born in the United States really means that you have to believe that there was a vast conspiracy 49 years ago involving the newspapers in Hawaii, which somehow conspired to print birth announcements for somebody who had been smuggled in from Kenya or Indonesia, take your pick, as a Manchurian candidate to be groomed over the 49 years to become president of the United States. It doesn't bear a lot of semblance to reality. But we're not talking about people who are just nuts here. They hear it because they cocoon into a certain set of media that either repeat or say, well, it may be true, it may not be true, we got to take the movement seriously. And of course, to believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim, most of those people, my guess is, were railing during the 2008 campaign against the church he attended for 25 years, the Church of Christ in Chicago. And how you kind of reconcile those two things is a little bit beyond my ken. But once again, it's a reflection of what people are hearing, and they're not hearing the same things that others are hearing. The MSNBC phenomenon mixed with the Fox phenomenon has created a big difference. Now, I haven't mentioned the other big factor here. I don't want to call it an elephant in the room because of those connotations, but that is redistricting. And the fact is that many of these cultural phenomena and many of the dynamics that have altered the way Washington works and led to the collapse of the center were triggered, at least in part, by the redistricting phenomena over the last 3 or 4 decades. It's a little bit like having a genetic predisposition and something, stress, triggers a gene, and then it leads to a whole series of other ailments that leave a patient in intensive care or close to code blue. And for many reasons, parties have always wanted to gain as much advantage as they could with the process in which every 10 years we have a census, we redistribute congressional seats and state legislative seats, and then draw new district lines. It's a phenomenon that we didn't have in the same way before 1910, before we actually changed the House of Representatives to fix its size at 435. Before that, many states didn't pay a whole lot of attention. They didn't even bother to reorient their district lines with the 10-year phenomenon, because we just see new districts added in and they'd worry about it when they wanted to worry about it. But it has now become, of course, this regular pattern. And it is a pattern where the stakes become much higher. When I first became aware of the redistricting phenomenon was really after the 1970 election, when I was fairly new to Washington, and I had become acquainted through Don Fraser, with whom I worked, with Phil Burton, the late, quite remarkable political figure from San Francisco, whose congressional district actually is now occupied by Nancy Pelosi. And Burton, without the aid of computers, I had segued from the political science department here, and I well remember when I left in 1967, when we would manipulate data, we would have a counter sorter that was about the size of this table expanded, and you'd use these computer cards and you'd put them through. And I was really proud. The last year I was here, we actually got our first calculator, and it was the size of this podium and had a screen like this, and I think it cost like $3,500. And you know, that screen, you could actually add, subtract, multiply, divide, and do square roots without having to use a slide rule or any of the other phenomena. Now I have a watch that costs $39 that can do 10 times what that could do, and you can pick up a calculator for $1.99. We didn't have computers, and Phil Burton oriented the districts in California by hand with big maps, with a brilliant mind, a calculator in and of itself, to gain advantage in California, and probably squeezed out 3 or 4 more congressional districts for his party. And that started a phenomenon moving down the road where parties were going to try to manipulate this process. Now, the ability to manipulate, however, increased very substantially right before Phil Burton, or in the decade before Phil Burton began his mastery, of course, with the Supreme Court inviting it and opening it up with a succession of decisions that were designed to deal with a real problem, a genuine difficulty of maldistribution of power, and by creating, with especially the Baker versus Carr decision, the principle of one person, one vote, it dealt with great injustices, more in the South than anywhere else, where you would find state legislative district lines drawn in a fashion that you could have one district representing a tiny group of people and another representing a huge and swollen group of people, all for nefarious purposes. And so the court tried to do something to bring a greater sense of justice and equality for very good reasons. But it sent us down a couple of very destructive paths, and especially what it has done with a series of other decisions from lower courts and then reaffirmed by the Supreme Court, a really troubling process where the only thing that matters to the court, with the exception of the Voting Rights Act and some instances where you do get distortion of minority representation, but otherwise a monomaniacal focus on one person, one vote, to a point where we actually had districts in Pennsylvania rejected because they varied by 17.5 people out of 600,000, which was not close enough to one person, one vote. Now, this is, what's the right word, technical word? Insanity. And it's insanity, first because these numbers that are used, the census tract numbers, are close to meaningless. We have enough shifts in population in this country that before the ink is dry on the census forms, they're no longer accurate. And at the same time, you open up, and have opened up, to party gurus in an era when you pack enormous power into an iPad or a laptop computer, enough that you can use those data to manipulate district lines, so that if the only thing you have to worry about is getting population exactly right using those census numbers, you can do all kinds of other vengeance and find ways to pack partisans into a smaller number of districts so that you can extract more out of others, and to manipulate the territory to give yourselves the best chance of winning more districts. That has not been a very healthy phenomenon, of course. Now, there's another aspect of this which also, I think, verges on absurdity. After this next census, and when we do our reapportionment, dividing the 435 House seats because of the population shifts between and among the states, and it looks like Minnesota may be a beneficiary of that, may just at the margins, this complicated formula, get to the point where they get an extra seat, and it's a seat that I guess would probably come from Missouri in the end, that would just barely lose out. But think about a phenomenon where every state has at least one seat, no matter how small the population. And that means we're going to end up with an increasing number of states which have been losing population, places like Wyoming and the Dakotas and Alaska and the like, that may end up having a representative who represents 300,000 people or 350,000 people. That's what the Senate's supposed to do. But we're going to have other instances where, because of the nature of the apportionment, we're going to have districts that are close to 1 million people. So the natural phenomenon, natural simply because of the way in which we've decided that the House should have representation within states, even though the Senate is supposed to represent states, something that you never would have viewed as a problem when you had, from the original Constitution, districts that were limited to 30,000 people, but now becomes a different phenomenon. So if it's one person, one vote, how can you justify South Dakotans having a representative for 300,000 people and California perhaps having somebody representing 1 million? It distorts the whole meaning of one person, one vote, and it is basically an antiquated phenomenon. Now, the way this has worked, of course, has created lots of other distortions within the political process. And many we know about, and Larry and others have talked about it and written eloquently about them. And what has happened, of course, with redistricting is that it becomes a phenomenon where the parties try to manipulate it to their best advantage, but in many states where you have at least enough division in government and enough division in the individual ambitions of those drawing the district lines, that as much as anything, those two phenomena contribute to creating more and more safe seats and more homogeneous seats. And it is those safe and homogeneous seats that limit turnover in any given contest, but that also mean that there is very little likelihood for now probably 370 of the 435 members of the House that they will be ousted by somebody from the other party. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into all of the phenomenon that in these kinds of districts, the only real challenge that members have is in the primaries. And in the primaries where you have a sliver of voters and it's the most activist ideologues who are there, that means the selection process tends to bring out ideologues. And for those people who get elected who are not ideologues, it's like a giant electromagnet pulling them to the left or the right, because if they aren't there, they will be ousted in the primary and replaced by somebody who will fit the predispositions of that small share of the electorate. Now, this is not the only reason we're getting polarization. And beyond the ones that I've mentioned, it is also important to realize that the Senate doesn't have district lines or redistricting. So you can't convince Bob Bennett, who lost his seat because he was not insufficiently conservative. He's one of the handful of the most conservative by voting measures Republicans in the Senate. But he voted for TARP, and he committed the apostasy of talking to progressive Democrat Ron Wyden of Oregon about a health care compromise. A plan, ironically, that would have been much more effective than the one that ultimately passed, but simply talking to the enemy, not sleeping with the enemy, was enough to cost him his party's nomination, even the ability to run in a primary to see what voters wanted. And Lisa Murkowski, and of course we could look at Arlen Specter, who left his party because he simply couldn't pass the litmus test to win renomination again. So it's a larger phenomenon, and things like the way we select candidates and the barriers that we have to voting that really create more incentives for ardent ideologues to vote than for others contribute here as well. But this redistricting process from the 1970s on through today has helped to change the culture and create a climate that encourages more extreme candidates to run and to use messages that will enable them to win, and a phenomenon where the more moderate ones, or the ones who are inclined to work across party lines, now know that that is like signing a death sentence if you want to maintain your political career. Changing this process is not going to solve these problems, but it is a step, a necessary step, to bringing some health back to the political arena. It is not going to happen through the Supreme Court, which is not going to abandon its standard. It's going to happen either through the process that you're working on here in Minnesota, state by state, and which we're seeing in many places, or possibly one of the more encouraging things of the last couple of years is a new bill introduced by a conservative Republican member of the House in California, Devin Nunes, to use the constitutional authority that Congress is given to regulate the time, manner, and place of federal elections to establish a different set of standards that states will have to use for congressional district lines. Of course, they wouldn't have to do it necessarily for their state legislative lines. That bill's not going anywhere, but the fact that you have